Hello, good evening and welcome. My name is David Macduff. I'm the founding chair of the North America Study Group of the Canadian International Council National Capital Branch. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to tonight's event, a discussion on the US midterms with representatives of the Republican and Democratic parties. Before I move into tonight's program, I'd like to conduct an Indigenous land acknowledgement, given that I'm located here in Ottawa. I'll be making such a reference. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor the courageous leaders past, present, and future. So many of you will be familiar with the work of the North America Study Group, but for those of you who may not, we came together in about 2018 and I've hosted events with 3 former and current US heads of mission, as well as the Mexican ambassador. Most recently, some of you may have had a chance to attend our event at the University of Ottawa on September 15th with US Ambassador Cohen, which was a great success. And particularly relevant to tonight's proceedings, in 2020, we hosted a conversation on the US presidential election with Mr. Rousseau, Larry Rousseau of the Democratic Party, and Mr. John Richardson of the Republican Party. And it was received very well by our membership. And so we've decided to invite them back. And I'm delighted that they've accepted, and also that PATRICIA Fortier, who is a CIC-NCB executive board member, has agreed to chair this event. PATRICIA is a respected, distinguished former Canadian diplomat who served in the United States as ambassador counselor in the embassy in Washington, as well as ambassador in various places elsewhere in the Americas. So tonight's panel, as I mentioned, is Larry Rousseau, the Democratic Party, John Richardson of the Republicans. At this point, I would also like to really emphasize the volunteers who've helped make this night possible: Samuel Amoa, Jillian, and Carolina as well. They've really contributed to the success of being able to put this together. And of course, the CIC really does depend on its volunteers for the success of this organization. So at this point, I'd like to invite Larry Rousseau of the Democrats to offer some opening observations. We suggested that each one of the panelists talk for about 10 minutes. And after that, we will invite PATRICIA to moderate the session and to contribute some opening questions as well. So Larry, would you like to please start?
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to the Canadian International Council, the National Capital Branch, for your kind invitation to be with you again tonight. As an American with dual citizenship, living in Canada for the past 51 years, Democrats Abroad Canada, of which I am part, has allowed me to not only watch what's happening back home, but be a real part of the political process. Voting from abroad allows us Yanks up here in Canada to fulfill fully our civic duty, which helps to preserve democracy in the USA. And never have we seen democracy so precariously perched as in the last several years. And sometimes we take it too much for granted. So of course, as my learned colleague who will be speaking shortly will certainly agree, our number one priority is to make sure that everyone who's entitled to vote gets to vote, and that every vote gets counted. And that's how we make sure that democracy and elections continue to be a vibrant part of our life. President Joe Biden, and it is music to my ears. I did support Bernie in the primaries back in 2020. And however, once the primaries were over and Joe Biden won the nomination, we rallied together and we get behind our candidate, whether Democrat or Republican. It's a tradition. We do that, and then we get out there and we hustle for our nominee. In less than 2 short years since Joe has been elected president, we have seen 3 major pieces of legislation that have been enacted that many are seeing as a true return via actions to economic nationalism that's going to create good unionized jobs in America and lessen America's dependence on global international market-oriented dynamics that were supposed to trickle down wealth to the middle class, but have not really worked over the past several decades. So the first piece of legislation that was passed, of course, was the bipartisan infrastructure law that laid the foundation for rebuilding America's roads, the rails and power lines, bringing lost jobs back to America. Next up, the CHIPS Act, rebooting the American microchip industry. And we saw the announcement of a 20 billion, 3,000 job microchip factory in Ohio. We're looking forward to that, right in the heart of America's Rust Belt. What a better way to say that we're on the way to renewal. And finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, which we'll certainly talk about a bit later, which is investing in America's renewable energy industry. So over the next 10 years, we're talking about 9 million new jobs. And that is what we call action. And President Biden is leading an administration that really addresses the lack of action we saw in the previous administration, which can only really point as an accomplishment to what? The largest tax cut for the rich in decades, which only helped Wall Street, didn't do a thing for Main Street. My learned friend supports a program, probably supports it, of privatizing Social Security, which what is on the platform this year, which means even more profits for Wall Street and less for our seniors who depend on Social Security to make ends meet. And overall, the Republicans this year are showing again that they're doing nothing to really address industrial policy other than leaving it to the markets to decide. And we believe, the Democrats believe, that that is not the way to go. We've also seen that we need to regulate the internet. Democratic senators are moving on bipartisan legislation to rein in the big tech companies such as Facebook. Republicans don't like regulation. We can't count on them to set new rules for social media. And the fact is, no technology company should be able to single-handedly move markets or redefine political discourse in America. That is frightening, to say the least. So Republicans oppose tax cuts for families with children. They wage war on public school teachers who want to educate our kids. Again, Republicans are all talk, no action. Again, when it comes to families, Democrats are the party of the child tax credit, public education, and affordable college. Did I mention the forgiving of student loan debt? Amazing, which would have been impossible without the tireless efforts of President Biden. Democrats are the pro-family party. And as long as we're going to be talking about families, how about a women's right to choose? In many instances, that is the decision that, yes, a woman may consult her spouse or partner on, but there is no way Democrats could ever countenance that being a decision that is going to be imposed by government or any government. Now, I know of one person who has given President Biden the moniker of Sleepy Joe. I won't mention that person, but I'm going to tell you that I was in Las Vegas in May at the International Convention of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Now, if you haven't seen Joe Biden speak in person, okay, then maybe you'll probably say, maybe it is Sleepy Joe, but you've got to see Joe in action. And I can tell you that that is a tough crowd to please. Electrical workers on their feet, time after time after time with applause. Why? Because the trade union movement in the United States and even up here, we recognize that Joe Biden has the union's backs. He's moving decisively on climate change, and in his recent recognition of Brazil's newly elected president's commitment to save the Amazon, well, that's the latest example. As he showed in Glasgow last year, through the excellent work of climate change ambassador John Kerry, the Biden administration is a game changer in showing international leadership and building consensus to get concrete action on the climate crisis. I truly believe that the Glasgow Declaration was saved by the efforts of the Biden administration. I was there. I saw it happen. It is doubtful that the previous president would have done anything to get movement on that front. So I look forward to leaving for Egypt this week to attend COP27, heading the labor delegation from Canada. And I know we will be able to count on Secretary Kerry and the entire Biden administration to help get that consensus, to move things forward in the right direction, to address climate change for us, for our children, our grandchildren, and for generations to come. There are so many issues to cover, and hopefully we will cover some of them in tonight's discussion, and I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Nobody's going to call you Sleepy Larry, I'm sure, after that highly energetic presentation. Really appreciate you offering your party's key points. John Richardson from the Republicans, would you like to come in for up to 10 minutes, please?
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Larry. Reminds me very much of 2 years ago. I don't question your commitment to President Biden and the Democratic Party in general. But I would like to think that this election goes way beyond just sort of pure partisanship. I agree that you identify some issues, but I see this as a general sort of a crisis of the future of American democracy, precisely because of the inability, in part, the Democrats, but I would say the Republicans as well, to really invest in any democratic renewal in their parties. Now, I believe that President Biden has had a long and distinguished career. And I believe that he has done some things well. I am particularly impressed by his most recent appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States, Justice Jackson, who has distinguished herself already amazingly. In fact, I listened to the affirmative action case being argued this past Monday. But I do find him to be unnecessarily divisive. I don't think that he should have, for example, made the appointment by announcing that he was going to simply appoint a Black woman, which I think had the effect of obscuring the really brilliant choice that he had actually made. And I think these things are extremely, this sort of identity politics and this sort of stuff is, I think, extremely divisive. Now, and I don't think, by the way, that the Democrats are the only people who are guilty of that. I think that in North America and Canada and the United States, I think the democratic process has largely descended into a partisan swamp where the interests of individual voters are hardly recognized at all. A couple of weeks ago, I did a podcast with, interestingly, a Democrat candidate in Ohio, in the 5th District, a man by the name of Craig Schwartz, whose sole reason for running was his view over the long term that regardless of political party, that the individual voters hardly mattered at all. To put another way, the political process has descended into nothing but a playground for the political parties. And to some extent, I think that, your introduction confirmed that. And the time has come, I think, for voters to recognize that and sort of lean back from these reflexive partisan voting positions and really ask themselves how these individual candidates and how these parties might actually help them in their day-to-day lives, irrespective of platitudes and that sort of thing. I mean, it is, I think, ridiculous to imagine, for example, that the Republican Party would dismantle something like Social Security, et cetera. I mean, these things, regardless of what anybody said, I mean, they're clearly not going to happen. So I would prefer to frame the real issues here somewhat differently. American elections are always important. They're always important because it's a large country, it's a powerful country, and whoever wins US elections will have an effect generally on the world. Look, for example, at the effect of rising US interest rates all over the rest of the world. And this is a constant, right? It reminds me of going back to when Reagan was president. This was one of the complaints when there were similar economic conditions. Secondly, I think that we need to look at this obviously on the effects of people who do reside in the United States. We'll call them resident Americans. And, for the first time, I think in my lifetime, I think that residents of America and Canada and North America are experiencing problems that have not historically been first world problems. We have massive inflation. We have literally prices are rising to the point where people can't afford to live anymore. And I don't think it's a time particularly to focus on these types of issues that I think have largely been sort of first world aspirational things. I think that basically the country's on fire. And I think the question is how to not only put the stuff out, but move the country in the right direction. And the third area where I think we ought to focus is this, that we are in Canada. You have indicated that you are a Canadian citizen. I am a dual citizen as well, and I have actually lived in Canada. Actually, Larry, believe it or not, slightly longer than you. All right, but we're both senior citizens, but we are senior citizens with respect to the time that we have been in Canada, and I think our commitments, at least in my case, certainly to Canada as a Canadian citizen, and as a U.S. citizen. And I think that we ought to discuss these issues in terms of how they affect the people right here at home in Ontario. We both live in Ontario, in the country where we live. Now, I do not really, although anybody who knows me knows that I'm not a fan of the Democratic Party particularly, but I don't think it's wise to move down the road tonight of mudslinging, demonizing one party or the other. I think that, I acknowledge there are things that I think that Joe Biden has done well. I think in some ways he's been very courageous. But, I'm going to say this anyway, okay? I think that both parties have got to invest in renewal. There is not in the Democratic Party an obvious successor to Joe Biden. That is a problem. And I'm not going to tell you that I think the Republican Party has got a particularly deep bench either. With that, I think I'll pause and we'll see how the discussion goes tonight.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I thought you offered a lot there to chew on in terms of a conversation and a great analysis of some of the challenges of the current U.S. Political system. At this point, I'd like to call on our moderator, PATRICIA FORTIER, who is going to move things forward from here in terms of the conversation. So questions are certainly welcome and can be provided in the chat. And she indeed may have some of her own. So PATRICIA, would you like to take it over?
Thanks so much, David. And thank you, John and Larry, for being here. I think this is probably the best conversation about this election that we're going to have, But I think what it also is, it's very much part of what the Canadian International Council does, which is look at international issues from a Canadian perspective. Now, you two have a double vision. You are double perspective. You're dual citizens. You've lived in Canada a long time, but you're also representing your political parties, and you vote in the USA, and you're obviously involved politically. So my question is, how do you work this double perspective? How do you see this working? And again, I find it so interesting because, of course, I lived in the US as well, and I was always comparing our two different, quite different political systems. So, John, would you like to start, and then Larry?
Sure. Wow, that's a really hard question. I've lived in Canada since, really my teenage years. And, gradually, I think over the years, I have probably morphed into a person where reflexively, I think about Canada's interests probably first, because this is where I live. But, certainly I have deep roots in the United States as well. And I guess the way I view these types of things would be to draw on the wisdom of Mark Twain, which is loyalty to country always, and the government when it deserves it. And I think that we're seeing an awful lot of that these governments do not deserve very much loyalty. I mean, I think that they're problematic. I think they cause problems not only for U.S. residents, but frankly, I think it's causing a lot of problems for Canadian residents as well.
Okay. Thank you. Larry, you've been elected to the executive of the CLC, which is actually both countries are represented. So you do this every day.
I'm glad that you picked up on that because I was thinking about that myself. We go on, we really tout that we have 3 million members across the country, but a good number of those members are members of what we call international unions, and they're called international because they are both in the United States and in Canada, usually headquartered in the United States. And so I find that I'm kind of a fish that swims in both waters quite nicely. I always tell the story of when I remember back in the 90s, I would always just show my birth certificate when I would go into the United States, and that was more than enough. And then I think it was shortly after 9/11 that they started to want to see passports. And I remember that I had a Canadian passport because it was cheaper than the US passport. And the border guard, US Customs, looked at me and said, "This says that you're born in the United States, but I don't have to believe this document because to me, this is a foreign document. This is not a United States document." And he said, "Don't ever come back here showing me this document again, or I will put you in that room over there and I'll interrogate you because I don't have to believe a word that's said in this document." And I then went and got my US passport. And when I go into the United States, I only show my US passport. But when I'm coming back to Canada, I take out my Canadian passport. So when I'm in the United States, I'm an American. I mean, and if anything happens to me, that's exactly how the government is going to treat me if I need the assistance of the United States government, and vice versa. So in Canada, we do as the Canadians do. In the United States, we do as the Americans do. And we do a nice balancing act when we have to be in the United States and talk about Canada, or when we're in Canada and we have to talk about the United States. But I will say that one of the policies of Democrats abroad, as a member of the executive here in the National Capital Region, is that I will not, in my capacity as a member of Democrats abroad, make any comments on Canadian politics.
Okay. Let's then move to the members of your party who you're reaching out to. I imagine you're connecting with and you're talking to and trying to get them to vote too. And I'd like to hear how many you think do vote. But I'm interested in the feedback that you receive, and what are the key issues that are arising when we've got a pretty interesting context, international economic instability, geopolitical big changes, a big war going on in Europe, and then the question that I think John touched on, which is institutional trust. So, John, I'm going to go first to you and ask you about your members of
Absolutely.
what you're hearing.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, let me just say that Democrats Abroad is a large, well-organized, well-oiled organization. There are more Democrats who are U.S. citizens outside of Canada than there are Republicans. However, I am an observer of this, and I can tell you, without a doubt, okay, that the number one issue for U.S. citizens living outside the United States is the U.S. tax policies, okay? There isn't even a close second.
Mm.
And this has been very much exacerbated over the last 10 years or so. I mean, Larry touched on the whole passport issue that started after 9/11. But in 2010, the US passed a law called FATCA, which had the effect basically of forcing the Canadian banks, pursuant to Canada changing its own laws to accommodate this, to fundamentally hunt down anybody with a U.S. place of birth and bring them into the U.S. tax system. And it's a lot more than just paying tax. It's effectively complying with the Internal Revenue Code, which imposes very punitive restrictions on most normal Canadian financial planning products. Now, there are three kinds, I think, of U.S. citizens living outside the United States. The first would be what I would call the expats. These are people who, 3 to 5 years, they come to Canada or somewhere with a clear intention of going back, and their whole financial and retirement planning is tied into the U.S. tax system. The second are what I would call immigrants. These would be people, I think probably Larry and I, all right, who, left the United States and live, I think, permanently in Canada. At least I live permanently in Canada. And whose sort of financial center of gravity is around, the whole Canadian retirement planning, tax system, et cetera. And the third are what are commonly referred to as these sort of accidental Americans who were born in the United States largely to a professor or something. They have really no memory of having ever been there. And, live in Canada and have to deal with this problem. Now, a lot of people are refusing to vote because of this. They do not feel at all supported. And I would agree. On this, I'm going to agree, and I'm going to be hard on Larry and his party, okay? They do not feel at all supported by Democrats abroad or, the political system generally in getting a solution to this. The government of Canada also changed its laws effectively to legislate these U.S. things in Canada. So they're not voting. So that's the number one issue. And then for the people who are voting, they tend to be people, at least in my experience, who really don't feel they have a lot of ties to Canada. They're more deeply, they are more concerned with, issues in the United States, whatever they may be, whether it's the abortion issue, which is, very newsworthy, because of recent events or something else. So my experience, reluctance to vote, frankly, a growing hostility towards the United States, and those are the reasons.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Larry, what's your view of how, who's voting? John mentioned that there were more Democrats than Republicans in Canada.
There definitely are. He has that right, he's basic overall. I think John has presented a good portrait of both groups in Canada, and in Toronto, where we have the largest group of Americans living in Canada, in the GTA, if you wish, and Southern Ontario generally. It is an issue, the taxation issue, and John, you're very kind to call Democrats Abroad a large, well-oiled organization. Thank you very much. It may seem so, but it is. However, it is an organization that has chapters across the country. We do tend to be well organized around the elections, but we also tend to be organized around lobbying as well. So Democrats Abroad is pushing right now HR 6057, which is a bill that is being introduced by Representative Don Beyer from the 8th District in Virginia in Congress. And we are trying to make sure that we get increasing support for it in not only the House but in the Senate, and it is to make sure that Americans are taxed where they reside. That we understand that people do live outside the country, and to be filing twice and often just filling in the paperwork, because I can tell you, I vote in the state of Florida, and I always, in Ontario, Floridians pull their hair out when they hear what I'm paying in tax on my salary. So I'm never in a position where I actually owe tax to the United States. But that being said, it's onerous, and a lot of people who are up here prefer to stay outside of the system, as John said, precisely for that reason. But the only way we're going to change that is if we are Americans and we have the right to vote. I cannot be telling members in Canada of the unions across Canada that if you have the right to vote, please get out there and vote here in Canada, and then turn around and not vote myself when I have the right to vote in the United States. Yes, there are obligations. Yes, it can be onerous. However, we can also effect change. And this is one way that we are trying to effect change. And we need to get support, and we need to get 6057 on the floor of the House, and we need to push that over into the Senate. And Congress is aware of the work of Democrats Abroad in trying to address one issue, which is tax fairness for all.
May I respond to that?
Yes,
Yes,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Larry, I thank you for being aware of HR 6057. Okay, I really do. I'm surprised, okay, because most Democrats abroad are not. So congratulations on that. Okay, that's the good news. The bad news is it doesn't do what you're saying it's doing at all, and nor is it intended to. The problem with this is that the U.S. defines tax residency in terms of citizenship. The only way to solve this is for the U.S. to move to the rest of the world where citizenship is in no way, shape, or form a criterion for tax residency. HR 6057 absolutely, positively does not do that. What it expressly does is retains and reinforces citizenship as a sufficient condition for U.S. tax residency, and simply alleviates some of the problems for some people on some days at some stages in their lives. And this is something I've done a lot of work on. I was actually in a meeting with Congressman Beyer, okay, on this issue. And although I am deeply appreciative of the awareness of the issue and the concern, which would have to be genuine, there's no other way it couldn't be. With respect, I would really recommend that you take the time to understand what the bill is actually doing, or more specifically not doing. And my concern with this type of thing is that because the issue is so complex, anything like this, that I don't think it's going to get passed, okay? But anything like this, okay, that does get passed will be regarded as being a solution to the problem when it is far from the problem. I actually know members internationally of Democrats Abroad Tax Committee, and I have a lot of respect for them, and I know they're working hard. But this is not a side issue. It is a gigantic issue. They have depreciated the value of American citizenship. If Americans were stocks, they would trade at a discount relative to every other citizen in the world. It affects every aspect of their lives, their marriage, their retirements, etc. And this, and you know, my view on the voting thing is, yeah, I think people should vote. I agree with you on that. I mean, I don't believe that democracy is a spectator sport, but I think they need to exercise their vote in whatever way they think will best solve this #1 problem. And that may or may not be voting for the Democrats, whether or the Republicans, you know, whether a member of either party. In fact, I formed an informal organization called US Voters Abroad precisely to deal with this issue. Now, you know, and I know that it's hard to get people to commit, you know, to organizing change, but this is gigantic. And I want to add before moving on that this is not just an issue somehow for US citizens living in Canada or any other country. Absolutely, positively not. Because what this does, it is not true. It is true that there are some Americans who do not pay tax, US tax, Americans in Canada, but there's also a lot of Americans in the United States who don't pay US tax.
That's true.
You know, because of the way the rules work. And believe me, the ones who do pay tax, it can be a life-destroying thing. You know, you talk about the 2017 CCJA. Well, you know, the effect of that was literally to confiscate the retirement savings of a number of Canadians. And my point on this is, while I support any efforts from anybody, including Democrats abroad, to get change in this area, what I don't like and what I do find objectionable is this sort of, you know, putting this issue on the back burner and driving around the country, you know, trying to pick up votes based only on somebody being born in the United States. Now, on that point, yes, I agree that citizens should be voting, but I don't think that the fact of being born in the United States establishes a sufficient condition to promote that.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, John.
I will have to just.
How you would be an excellent advocate, and I know that you're as a lawyer, you're working with us all the time. Can we just draw a line under that? Because I think we want to get out. We want to get into some other.
But 15 seconds, just a rebuttal of 15 seconds. I have yet to see a bill. I have yet to see a bill presented in Congress that will get consensus, #1. And what do the Republicans have to propose? At least we're proposing something. And that's what I made in my opening remarks. At least we've got something. We may not agree about it, but at least there's something.
I never thought that we'd be having a big conversation about tax policy. But I can see why it would be. And I want to encourage the participants who are watching this to ask questions. The other thing I think that makes Canadians who don't have, you know, dual citizenship think a lot about is the economic side of things. And one of the things that you said, Larry, was talking about economic nationalism. And certainly one of the truisms of Canadians watching American politics used to be that Republicans were free traders and Democrats were economic nationalists. And we thought, oh, we're going to have trouble with, you know, the Democrats, and our trade will work better with the Republicans. Like so much in the world, that seems to have been turned, you know, a little bit in different directions. But I just want to get at this question of what does the Democratic Party, what does the Republican Party have to offer in terms of this question of economic nationalism, which is not confined to the US right now. I mean, a lot of countries are looking at this, but with Canada and the US, it's always an issue. So Larry, could you just start?
Yeah, sure. Listen, I think that, economic nationalism can be a loaded term, but let's call it for what it is. What the Americans wanted to hear, I think, and what both parties to a certain extent with different approaches are talking about is that we have to bring jobs back to America. Number one. And how do you do that? Okay, I think that my Republican friend will say that we have to let the markets do what the markets do, and that government intervention and government regulation and government policy will not succeed at it. And of course, we're saying that it can't happen without government intervention and government policies that will incite companies to invest in America. So what we have to realize is that the mass exodus of good manufacturing jobs, which may never come back, but which may come back in a different form when we're talking about renewable energy, when we're talking about the new economy, when we're talking about technology. If we are going to get American industry to reinvest in America, then the conditions have to be right. There are more market-oriented mechanisms that some people feel is the way to go with that, but we also have to look at what can, such as Joe Biden did, kickstart the process without controlling the process. We're not talking about socialism here. We're talking about kickstarting the process so that you can at least encourage firms. For example, infrastructure spending will have spin-offs. So just that alone, the first bill that was passed, we know that that will have an impact. Now, whether countries that are in the US, Mexico, Canadian agreement have the right to bid and have the right to get, a piece of that action. The devil's in the details, of course. That's the lobbying that is done by Canada, the lobbying that's done by Mexico. We tend to come to a place of agreement. However, I believe that the Democrats have finally put us on the path. We can see it happening. I mentioned it in my opening remarks, and we see that jobs will be coming back. Jobs are being created, and that is what is needed going forward. If we leave it to the markets, I don't think that we'll see anything like what we've seen in the past couple of years.
Thanks, Larry. I mean, as you know, America First sends chills down Canadian spines. So, John?
Well, I don't want to continue the discussion of taxation, all right, but this is primarily how this is done, right? Through changes in the tax code, providing preferential taxation on something that's sourced from this or that, through foreign tax credit rules, et cetera. I do think that government plays a role in everybody's lives in a number of different ways. I think that some ways this happens are perhaps less obvious than others. Against that though, all right, I mean, somebody has to pay for employees, right? So, I mean, companies have to be profitable, and there's, a zillion moving parts to this sort of thing. On the trade thing generally though, talking about the successor to NAFTA, the USMCA agreement, and you're raising the question of these things sending chills down Canadian spines or whatever. I think a gigantic problem is the provision in that agreement that would basically allow the U.S. to pull out of that agreement on 6 months' notice if Canada were to enter into a free trade agreement with China, or what they call a non-market economy. Now, this, of course, was signed, done and dusted in 2018 before the recent problems. But I think that this needs to be viewed internationally as well. Anything that goes on in the U.S. has effect on other countries, including Canada. yeah, I think government plays a role, but not as big of a role, and as perhaps as direct of a role as perhaps Larry would want.
It strikes me that since we are all interrelated, and Canada and the U.S. more than most, what we call CUSMA, because we put Canada first, is something that is pretty important. And as Larry said, I mean, the Canadian government did a lot of lobbying to make sure that the IRA, which is not the, it's not the Republican Army of Ireland, but renewables, that it included its partners. Whereas we've had situations where Canada has been deemed a threat to U.S. security.
It's outrageous.
Because we made steel and aluminum. Will either of your parties provide some calm waters for this?
Well, let's just it's funny when you mention what happened with steel. The steel workers, a union that has members in the United States as well as Canada, we were hopping mad when the previous administration made it a security issue. I don't think that would have happened, under this administration. So we have to, decisions matter. And when political decisions are made, of course, Canada is going to be looking at everything. I mean, what the Canadian government had to do, and I'm just not going to cross that line, but what the Canadian government had to do to go down to Washington and make sure that that was going to be pulled back, was amazing. But it was also obligatory, because we always say that when the United States sneezes, Canada catches pneumonia. So because it is 10 times the size, then of course, whatever the United States does is going to have an impact economically on Canada. So, when we're talking about trade, when we're talking about rebuilding the manufacturing capacity, but the economic engine that is the United States, look, the United States was the largest economy in the world for decades. And what we're seeing is that if the trend continues, then China should meet the United States in terms of GDP, over the next decade or so. And so what choice does the United States have but to double down and say, we've got to do something to make sure that we continue to be ahead? And so that's what we're seeing. And I think we're going to see more of it under the Biden administration. But I have a feeling that we'll see, along the same lines, even if it were a Republican administration.
If I may on that, I really don't think that this type of stuff is dependent on the administration. There's a deep sort of civil service in the United States and all these administrative agencies, which really carry the ball in this type of stuff. The issues are enormously complicated, and I have very serious doubts as to whether these sort of, people who come into office temporarily and, their various temporary assistants really are capable of taking a long-term view on this type of stuff. Anyway, I don't see anything coming out of the United States that is going to acknowledge and respect the interests of other countries in the foreseeable future.
But Patricia, I'm sorry, but I mentioned it in my opening remarks. You are a diplomat, and I'm sure that you have experienced yourself the importance that politicians can play
I have.
in some of these issues. As I said, if John Kerry and the administration had not really forcefully tried to bend some arms and put some pressure on in Glasgow, we would have come away from Glasgow with nothing, not even a declaration. And it is important. It really, really makes a difference. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That we will agree.
Well, that's great.
We will disagree.
And I'm on the board of a green tech company in Vancouver, Green Lane Renewables. So I'm obviously interested in this. We're getting towards the end, and I just want to move to a different place that actually John brought up. And I still don't see any questions, so I'm not asking any of the questions that you out there would like to ask, because I'm not seeing any. So please send some. But this question of trust, it's a precious commodity, can be lost quickly. And here in Canada, we've seen during the inquiry on the Emergency Act, which dealt with the convoy protest in Canada, that it's the question of, who's got our back was being asked, and it had pretty stunning effects. We've also seen polls in the US that say that trust is eroding, both on the left and the right, and that faith and trust in democracy is eroding, which is, a pretty extraordinary thing on both the left and right for different things, institutional trust, etc. There's a question here that, will these midterm elections help? Because we're seeing that now there's a lot of interest all the way down to the very local levels in the election officials who might be elected to opine on, for example, election results. And if election integrity is at issue, then that person is very important. And we're also seeing this question of ideology and identity at play during this. So I don't know who wants to go first, because it's a big mess of things, but can we talk about that for a while? Because this is really important. It's important for the world.
John? Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, I actually think that's what the biggest issue is. I see these elections as a sort of, an endless succession of this stuff. And I think that there is a huge crisis of what the democratic process should be in both the US and Canada. And I think what I would say would apply equally to Canada. What we have, sure, I support the Republican Party, but at my heart, okay, I'm more of an independent. And what I mean by that is that I believe that elected representatives should actually represent the people in their ridings or their districts or, whatever they're called. And the problem we've got right now is that these governments have gotten so big, these parties have gotten so pervasive that democracy, has essentially become a playground for the political parties, and the individual voters, I think, are basically roadkill. Now, what will happen here? Well, I don't know, but I think some good things could happen. If you can find a candidate to vote for that you think is a kind, public-spirited person who is at least willing to listen to the things that concern you, not necessarily agree, but at least listen, then I think you might have a voting base, a voting public, if you will, that might actually be satisfied with the results of these elections. But as long as these elections are seen as basically just a sport for the political parties, I think you're always going to have unhappiness. I think you're going to have distrust. I think you're going to have unexpected and extreme results, one way or the other. And my view is that the parties need to be watered down considerably. I would support for starters, I think that members of the executive branch in the United States, the president of the cabinet, should not be permitted to be members of political parties at all. That will solve the, the perceptual problem, these judicial appointments, etc. Anyway, so I think it's a problem of the parties. I think that at a certain point, a democracy has evolved to the point where they become democracies only in the sense that somebody's allowed to cast a ballot at best, and at worst, harassed and encouraged to vote just for the sake of voting, et cetera. And unfortunately, that's where I think we are now.
So
Unfortunately,
can I just do a quick follow-up? So you sound like you're advocating as an independent, almost an independent party. So are you suggesting that that you need more than two parties? Is there any changes in the Constitution that would be required?
I think, okay, I mean, you didn't ask me the question, okay, but I'll answer the question unasked. All right. For years, I would listen to, America has the oldest constitution in the world, this sort of stuff. And, that was intended to be conveyed as a matter of pride, et cetera. But the problem now is that it is a constitution that is ill-suited to, the 21st century. And, I think a very visible example would be, there's all this upset about this, was it Jones? What's the name of the abortion decision, the Alito decision that came down recently? There's a lot of sort of sense of betrayal and upset about that. But, the reality is that it's very reasonable from a legal and lawyer's point of view to say that, there's no right of privacy in the Constitution, that could, on which you could hang a right to abortion, this sort of stuff. And unfortunately, I'm not taking a personal position on this or a position for a party or anything, but I think it's entirely rational to think that the Alito decision was the correct decision as a matter of law. So where does that leave you? It means that the problem is that the Constitution doesn't have the built-in protections and the types of things that reflect life in the 21st century. There's nothing wrong, okay, with seeing this from the point of view of the necessity of some kind of constitutional renewal, which might be rejigged to allow for more parties. I think the time is right for a strong independent candidate, at the very least, to shape the issues better, so they wouldn't be just totally Democrat versus Republican, this sort of stuff. And frankly, I'm always amazed when I hear Larry. I know that he's always in overdrive, trying to make this Democrats versus Republicans. But, it's really amazing how much I think Larry and I really do agree on, and I think that's the truth generally. So bottom line, politics has got to stop being a playground for the political parties and got to become a process that represents the interests of the electorate.
I don't see John as being a Trump Republican. I'll just say that to start with. And I think that when Liz Cheney is saying that exactly what John was saying, that you have to look at the folks that you're going to vote for and make sure that you're voting someone who's going to work on the issues. So when the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision came down, this is polarizing, and nothing, and as long as we have, look how the previous president rammed through practically 3 Supreme Court justices. This adds to exactly what John was talking about, where all of a sudden, where is the polity in politics? Where is where are we talking about public policy, whereas we're not talking about tribalism? When things like this happen, one begets the other, and then the next thing you know, we're no longer talking to each other at Thanksgiving dinner. We're just talking at each other if we're having Thanksgiving dinner together. It's not like it was 10 and 20 years ago, is it, John? It's amazing how polarized it's become. And that's what gets me, really concerned, that this is not sustainable. But in the meantime, until we get to the dream that John is talking about, okay, in the meantime, we've got elections next week that may exacerbate, completely the situation even furthermore than what we've got today. How do we stop it? How does it stop? I don't know. It almost seems like a train out of control. But what we're telling our members and what our members are telling us is that they're gonna get out and vote, and they've got to get out and vote. At least if we vote, that's the only hope we've got.
Thank you. Now, Lynn has a question, but I can't see it. Can somebody tell me what that question might be?
There is a question. I see a question from Akash, from Marvin, from Stephanie, from David. Oh, David Dement. Hello, David. A long time no see. And Zulfi, but I don't see a question from Lynn so far.
Okay, well, I don't seem to be able to see those questions. So I'm just going to.
Would you like me to read any of them?
Yeah, read them all out.
Okay, okay. As quickly as I can. So
Okay.
Akash started with American politics seem awash with poisonous levels of polarization, which John very eloquently did. Okay, we talked about that. Okay, can you see a path towards social reconciliation and national unity? And then Zulfi asks, if Republicans do win control of both the House and the Senate, as the polls are suggesting, and has often happened in past midterms, do you expect any discernible change in U.S. foreign policy in respect of Ukraine and the China-Taiwan issue? John tends to think that it won't, or that it may not have that much.
Let's
okay, and should I keep going?
Yep, keep going.
Okay, and then James McCormick, anonymous attendee, how do you see the results of the midterms will affect the Congress and Senate's trade attitude towards Canada and the world in general? Noticing both Democratic and Republican candidates are running on more protectionist campaign lines, so on both sides. David asks, you have the unique perspective of participating in the politics of both countries. To what extent do you think Canada is immune to some of the developments and polarization we've seen? And then Stephanie asked, how do you get politicians to stop using democracy as their personal playground, on what John said? And where are the citizen groups to counter the misinformation and all the platforms that use it to restore values and commitment of true democracy?
Let me just say how sorry I am that I haven't seen those. I'm really sorry. And I just got a message from the tech person saying that they haven't seen it either. So I'm not quite sure.
My goodness. Okay, but I see them here, but we've covered quite a bit in those questions, though.
We've covered I think the question on the trade side. I think we've covered the question about, playground, etc. I think one of the questions are citizen groups. I think also the Ukraine, and the question, I think the outstanding question, what will happen if the Republicans get the Senate and the Congress, I think is interesting. And also, I think that's all we're going to have time for.
John, what will happen to NATO if the Republicans take the House and the Senate? Will that put us on a path towards saying we're not going to fund NATO, we're going to defund NATO, and are we going to fund Ukraine?
I don't believe it at all. I think that the only thing worse for the United States than paying a disproportionate amount on NATO would be to not. This whole Ukraine thing, which, depending on your point of view, if you're a disciple of Professor Mearsheimer, you would have seen this coming. The University of Chicago professor has been saying for years that this was going to be happening precisely because of NATO expansion and that sort of stuff. But I think that what you could use the word invasion of Ukraine, but that's what I'll call it. I think what it has done is reinforce the necessity and the desirability of NATO as an alliance. I think that discussion, I think, was that only during the Trump administration of defunding NATO on this. I mean, I don't recall having heard that before. I think that is, was not well thought through. And I just don't think it's going to happen. I mean, actually, as I haven't really thought about it, but thank you for the question, because now I'm thinking about it. I mean, this would have the effect of isolating the United States in relation to China. I mean, I realize that, it's a different part of the world, et cetera. But, I think that not only is NATO going to continue, but I think it's probably going to strengthen.
So I agree completely. I agree with you on that, John. However, if the Republicans take the House and the Senate, I can see a previous president saying the path is open to run for the presidency, and what that really scares me, because I could see then, in that instance, that we could be in very, very dire straits with the NATO alliance, and if it's not the NATO alliance itself, well, it's certainly the support of Ukraine to repulse the invasion and respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
One of the advantages of living in the closest thing that there is to democracies in the world, in the U.S. and Canada, far from perfect, but probably the best we've got, is that I cannot imagine a decision like that being made by one person. Whether there's constitutional authority or not, I just cannot imagine it. I think there's enough on that type of thing. I mean, I think there's enough checks and balances. It's not the type of thing that can be delegated to, the Treasury Department or something like that to come up with their own plan. So no, I think that Putin badly miscalculated on this, and I think that this has had the effect of strengthening the very institutions that he wanted to weaken.
So far, yes, indeed.
So far,
I'm going to ask you to think past the midterms now. One of the things that struck me about U.S. political system is that there's so many elections. There's no time to really catch your breath. You're on to the next one as soon as one is gone. And it goes, as I mentioned, it goes right down to very local levels. Things that in Canada are not elective are elective in the US. So it's quite interesting. So let's look, how will the midterm results affect the 2024 presidential race? And I'd like each of you to think about who should be the nominee for your party. So who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Okay.
Very quickly. I'll try. I believe that the Democrats will keep the Senate. The House but the House at this point, according to the polls, and the polls could be completely wrong on this, but according to the polls, the margin, if the Republicans take the House back, is going to be much, much slimmer than they thought it would be 6 months ago. I think that Trump is looking at this very closely, and that the signal from the results of November 8th, which we probably won't know the full extent of until the end of November, and everything that's going to bring on, Trump will watch that very closely, because Ron DeSantis, of course, is kind of making all the noises of that if things are not as good for Trump as Trump hopes following these midterms, then maybe DeSantis has a chance to take him on. So it'll be very interesting to watch what will happen on the Republican side following the midterms. But I think the stronger the Democratic result, the weaker Trump's hand will be in saying, okay, I'm throwing my hat into the ring. I think that's maybe what we'll see.
And what about President Biden? Should he run again?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why. For the same reason he ran, he became the nominee. Everybody thinks that it was Sam Clyburn who came out, before the Super 8 in the Super Tuesday in March last year, and Clyburn came out and said, Black folks have, we're going to vote for Biden. People do not realize just where Biden's support was. It was not only in the Black community, but it was also with the unions as well. I talked to you about IBEW. There are unions in the United States that were behind Biden in December, in November, before 2020, in 2019, and who were telling their members, we are sticking with Biden, and he was put for dead. He was dead in the water in January and February, dead in the water. And then all of a sudden, boom, the spark happened. But when it really hit the broad swath of primaries, Biden came up. And it's not a question of his age, because I told you, if you've seen that guy in person, all right, he's got just as much energy as I do. All right. And he's 20 years, he's not, well, you know, there's not 20 years between us, but almost. But that being said, I believe that he's got what it takes to take us past this possibility of the Republicans putting forth a candidate that will, that could win it. Biden still will have the support that he had in 2020, in 2024. I believe he will.
Thank you. On.
Well, of course, I don't know the answer to that, but I will speculate. But your first question, I think, was how might the results of the election next week affect the upcoming presidential election? I think was your first question, right? And I think the answer is in the same way that these elections always do. You know, let's say the Democrats hang on, you know, they're going to generate more hostility because they're the government. You know, that just, I mean, that's, you know, that's just a reality. And, you know, it's going to incentivize people to look beyond that. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I really believe that nominees for president should not be tied to these political parties. I mean, it makes it very hard, you know, to look at President Biden objectively, should that happen, right? I don't see anything in the next week that is going to increase trust and satisfaction with government. I mean, you know, without mentioning names, I mean, it's pretty obvious that there are some extremely bizarre, you know, races going on there, right? You know, candidates who would not meet anybody's standard for, you know, in both parties, okay, would not meet anybody's standard. And, you know, and this is a gigantic problem. So I don't know, but I don't see anything good coming out of it at all, other than, you know, providing support for one, you know, a wedge, if you will, for one party or the other, you know, to continue the, you know, the institutional warfare. You know, it's normal for the, you know, the party that is not the party of the president to lose a lot of seats. So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. Now we move on to the presidential election, and I'm going to begin with, and, you know, probably going to offend everybody by saying this, but, you know, whatever. The nightmare scenario in the United States would be for Biden and Trump to have a round two.
Oh, God.
It would be an absolute nightmare, okay? Because it would expose American democracy as something that is just completely captive to the political parties, you know, it would remind people of the Soviet Union in the late 70s and 80s, where there was that succession of, you know, leaders dying. Now, I do think age matters, okay? Not because so much of a loss of cognitive ability, but because, you know, we've moved into a digital world, all right? And there's a lot of people who grew up for the digital world, and there's probably a majority now who are in the digital world. And I really believe that whoever the president is has got to be fluent in both those worlds, because, you know, things that Larry's talking about are primarily, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but last century industrial world type of stuff, you know, the unions, et cetera. And, you know, and what we're dealing with in the digital age are, you know, the attempt to get new tax treaties, you know, to, you know, reflect the fact that, you know, a lot of economic activity is carried on virtually, et cetera. And I think that whoever the government is, it has to either be, preferably be led by, but certainly be largely represented by people with one foot in each of those two eras, you know, to understand how they work and how they interact. And, you know, a lot of the frustration, you know, I think coming from voters, if you were to, you know, talk to this guy that I spent an hour with who's running in Ohio as a Democrat, is, you know, just, hey, you know, we feel left behind, you know, I mean, we're last century people, you know, et cetera. And this is a big problem. So I don't see either party well equipped in that regard. I really don't. I mean, I don't see a lot of investing in the future of the parties. I mean, if I may offer a personal, I emphasize opinion only, I think by kicking Tulsi Gabbard out of the Democratic Party was the biggest mistake the Democrats ever made, you know, in the sense of, you know, investing in the party. Now, so you're asking me now who I think the nominees will be. I think President Biden has an excellent chance of being renominated. I really do. Not because I think he's been a great president, which, you know, I mean, I don't, but I don't think he's been as bad as, you know, as his critics. And I think he's done some good things. But the problem is I don't see a successor in the Democratic Party. You know, I mean, you know, you got to invent that person. Maybe Larry should be that person. I don't know. I mean, Larry's well informed. I think a good guy, you know, but I don't see a successor. That's the thing, right? I see more successors in the Republican Party, but I don't see ones that you know, really are up to the job of you know, which I think is delivering the basic message in North America that all political parties need to convey, is that, come on, what unites us is far, far greater than what divides us, far, far greater. And it's time to focus on the things we have in common and the goals that we must achieve together, and stop wasting time on, you know, presumptively demonizing people in other parties, et cetera.
Thank you so much. And I'm, as I said at the beginning, I think this will be one of the best debates of this election, and I am confirmed in that. There's been a good discussion on everything from tax policy, which I get because I have a condo in Florida, as David mentioned, but also of the fundamental challenges that that the USA is facing right now, and the rest of the world to some, you know, to a large extent, and the question of trust and politics. I just want to say thank you so much for being part of this. Thank you for this very Canadian discussion that was also American. And I'm going to ask David if he has anything that he would like to say to finish off.
Yes, so at the very start, we agreed that Larry would begin, and then John would go second. And if there were any closing remarks, John would speak first and then Larry. So I thought perhaps a closing word from John and Larry if they wish to go, and then we'll conclude the evening. John?
Yeah, well, I thought I closed sort of a minute ago with my speech there, but I think I would close by saying thank you for including me in the discussion. I really enjoyed it and I really appreciate it. And thank you again, Larry. I do enjoy meeting you, although it's not that often. You know, you're a good guy, and you have you know, I think insightful, constructive comments. I don't agree with all of them, of course, but you are a good guy. So thank you for that. Look, this is way, way bigger than this election next week. The elections in the United States have an effect on the world. They have an effect on resident Americans, and they have an effect on Canadian residents as well. I wish we'd talk more about, you know, the effect on Canadian residents, which I think is very, very important. I'm not an advocate, although I don't believe democracy is spectator sport, and I agree that people should vote. I'm not an advocate of just encouraging Canadian resident citizens to vote just because they happen to be technically U.S. citizens. Okay, I really don't, because you know, it's you know, they're not sufficiently invested in the thing. But that's nothing more than my personal opinion. The time has come for people to stop reflexively voting for parties in both the US and Canada. even if there are no independents. I think that all candidates deserve a good and important look. And, you know, I think it was the great legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin who defined, by the way, I had no interest in this stuff in law school. These are recent interests. But, you know, he said that what equality in the democratic process means is the equal concern and respect of the legislature, not doing stuff for people, but hey, I acknowledge you, I hear you, I understand you have this interest, and I'm willing to consider how this can be accommodated in the democratic process. Unfortunately, that's not happen on any level today. And I think that what voters need to do is not get out just, you know, I'm a Democrat or a Republican, but to vote in a way that will convey the message that woe betide these politicians who are enslaved by partisan interests and do not pay attention to the needs and interests of the people who are being asked to vote for them. The end.
Okay, thank you, John. My sentiments are very similar to yours. Thank you for your friendship. I think that if we were the last two standing, I think that would be the hope that the American dream, this is what it's about, that we are able to stand on both sides of the aisle and yet agree to disagree and decide to work on what we can work on. We got into the weeds on HR 6057, but you know, I would have loved to get into a real, you know, hour-long discussion with you on that, and we may do that yet. So I think that there is hope. I'm an internal optimist. That's the American in me, and I believe that no matter how dark it gets, and we are in a very dark time right now with you know what we've discussed, but I do believe that somehow the people are going to be the ones who are going to wake up and say, okay, enough is enough. And whether that takes the form of what John has been proposing, or whether that takes another form, we'll see. But in the meantime, I'm going to vote Democrat, and I'm going to continue to vote Democrat, especially I'm a trade unionist. I know where the Democrats can consistently come down on the issues of workers' rights and human rights. And that's my bottom line. And I am darn proud that we have a Black woman in the Supreme Court of the United States. It's historic. And I think that no matter what politics went into it, it shows that it can be done. And that's what the American dream is all about. It can be done.
Larry,
Thank you.
I am very proud that she's such a distinguished jurist.
Yes, she
Okay,
is.
I'll
She's
leave it at
fabulous.
that. Okay.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed.
Superb judge. Distinguished.
And it's about time.
Oh, no.
Okay.
President Trump's appointment of justice, I think it's Morris, was a superb appointment. Okay, these things are by accident, not design, but in any case, on both
that note
of the political line.
Thank you, Canadian International Council, for your invitation.
Likewise.
Thank you. And for those who put in questions, I'm really sorry I didn't see them, but I hope we covered all of them. And I want to thank everybody who was involved with this, with David, Jillian, Carolina, and Samuel, and then all of the people who are online. I noticed we have 31 left. Thank you to those 31 who are staying right to the end. Thank you so much. And we are adjourned. And I want to especially thank our two panelists.
Thank you, Patricia.
Show things can happen, and if you've got goodwill. Okay, take care. And we're going to be watching those midterm elections.
And vote.
Okay. Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay.
All right.